I'm here today with Kevin Nye. Kevin is the author of a new book titled Grace Can Lead Us Home, A Christian Called to End Homelessness, from Herald Press. Kevin is an assistant director of programs at the Center in Hollywood, a non-religious nonprofit doing services and advocacy for people experiencing homelessness in Los Angeles. He's a graduate of Fuller Seminary and completed the course of study and necessary hours for ordination in the Church of the Nazarene before stepping away from the ordination process and surrendering fully to this vocation to which God has called him. Kevin is quickly becoming a recognized and respected voice on the intersection of faith and homelessness, and he's written on these issues for publications including Fathom magazine and Red Letter Christians. You can learn more at kevinmnye.com. That's kevinmnye.com. So Kevin, thanks so much for joining us. It's really great to meet you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. It's funny hearing that version of the bio because some of those things have changed actually pretty recently.
Oh, is that right? Okay. Well, maybe you can update us.
Sure. I'm actually now located in Minneapolis, Minnesota. We moved across the country about a month ago. And so that also means I'm no longer at the Center in Hollywood. I'm now at an organization here called Youth Link.
What's the name of it again? I'm sorry?
Youth Link.
Youth Link. Okay. And
yeah.
Can you tell us more about that organization?
Yeah. Still in the field of homelessness, but focused on distinctly the youth population, so 18 to 24. And yeah, very similar to what I was doing before in terms of drop-in resources, housing resources, kind of the full spectrum of homeless services being done here. And my position here is the housing director.
Okay. So is it specific to the Minneapolis area then?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. So maybe, before we get into the book, you could tell us a little bit more about your background, before you came there.
Sure. Yeah. So I grew up in the church, specifically in the denomination, the Church of the Nazarene, and understood around the time I was a teenager some sort of sense of call to ministry, and pursued that through going to a Nazarene university and studying theology and ministry, and later deciding to go to seminary at Fuller, as you mentioned, which is in Southern California. And during that time, really, became interested and inspired by the aspects of the Bible, of Jesus, of the prophets that were geared towards social justice. And so as I was really trying to decide where that was leading me career-wise and how that was going to gel with what I had understood as a very kind of general call to ministry that I would only really imagine as, pastoral ministry, right? By the time that I was graduating seminary, I was recently married and getting at that point where I really needed to figure out a career. I couldn't just keep working in coffee shops. I just really started to ask that question and have the more serious conversations with my denomination about what a future in pastoral ministry could look like. And our visions just weren't really aligning. And so understanding, my passion for social justice and kind of a broader imagination of what ministry could be. I was in Los Angeles and I looked around and saw homelessness as the primary crisis that we were facing as a city, and wanted to, be a part of changing that. So I got a job at the center, just kind of as a frontline worker, case manager, essentially. And yeah, I was there for almost 6 years, and now I'm doing similar work in Minneapolis, and kind of understand that this to be my realm, my vocation.
Well, more recently, I've been really interested in understanding how people make such major changes like you have in vocation. I did the same thing, right? I mean, I worked on completely different things a long part of my life, and more recently, much more focused on, things that are more spiritual and hopefully more help people. And,
Mhm.
you kind of, and so I've been reading like Father Richard Rohr, with the book Falling Upward, right, that talks about the first half of life and second half of life, that, the first half of life for a lot of people is more ambition oriented. And the second half is maybe more altruistic oriented. Um,
Mhm.
how did you kind of decide to make that relatively abrupt shift?
Mhm. Well, I would be lying if I didn't say that part of it was made for me, in that some of my uh, kind of changing and broadening beliefs precluded me from being able to be ordained in the denomination that I was raised in, uh, and so that made that shift a little more necessary. If I had decided that I still really wanted to pursue, traditional church ministry, I would have had to take a lot of steps back and start over in a new denomination. And yeah, so it's in many ways it sort of just happened that way, kind of outside of my control, um, and I was just kind of doing the next thing that made the most sense, and now here I am. It didn't feel at the time like I was making a cataclysmic career shift as much as just you know doing what made the most sense to me at the
Mm.
time and seeing what happened.
um, did it feel a little bit like jumping off a cliff, or?
At points, yeah. I mean, I when I was in that process with my denomination where they were asking hard questions and I was giving hard answers. It was a lot of time spent in therapy, kind of sorting through that process and what that loss meant and the implications it had on kind of my sense of call and sense of purpose. Yeah.
So I have to ask you, I grew up in a small town in Illinois where Olivet Nazarene University is.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I was a kid growing up, a lot of the kids were Nazarenes. A lot of the kids were Catholic because that town of Bourbonnais, Illinois had originally been primarily a Catholic community. And I was neither one. You went to a United Methodist church in another town. So I kind of would watch these reactions of kids, about religion, between these other two groups that were very, very different,
Yes.
in terms of their outlook on things. So that didn't happen to be where you went to school, was it?
No, I went to Southern Nazarene, which is in Oklahoma City.
Okay. Okay. Well, anyway, let's get to your book. As I mentioned, the title is Grace Can Lead Us Home, a Christian Call to End Homelessness. How did that book come about? How did it take shape and what motivated you to do it?
Yeah. Well, I've always been a writer. Before I was anything else, before I knew or had any sense of any other call or vocation, I loved to write as a kid, whether it was fiction or nonfiction or imitating superhero stories, Um, and so I've always had a dream of writing at least as some part of my adult life. And so when I started in uh, in the work of addressing homelessness, I thought like maybe this is something I could write about one day, but obviously wanted to get to know it and actually be you know have have enough to talk about and enough understanding. And so after a few years, I thought, okay, I think I'm starting to be at a place where I want to write about this. I was certainly experiencing a lot, and when particular stories stood out to me, I would write the story. One, just as a way of kind of processing and remembering what was happening, but also thinking like maybe these are significant stories that have changed my perspective on certain things. So I'm gonna have these for later. Um, and then I would say about the end of 2019. Um, I think there was just kind of a turning point in kind of understanding. I think that's also when I kind of understood like, oh, I think this is actually going to be my career for a long time and not just this is what I've been doing for a couple of years. And also where I felt like, okay, I really think I understand homelessness in a really broad sense. And I really started to question, okay, why is this problem so big? What perpetuates this? And as I started asking that question, it really came down to this idea that we really have all of the resources that we need to end homelessness. We have the methodology, we have the money, we have, in some cases, we have the housing already. But what was preventing us from actually ending homelessness? And more, I realized that it was an ideological issue. That ultimately we, as a society, just really want to believe or do believe that certain people deserve to be poor and deserve to be homeless. And the more I thought about that and kind of researched that, it occurred to me that anything that's ideological is theological, right, for people of faith. And that idea had really taken root in the church. And in some surveys, it actually is more prevalent in the church than outside of the church. This idea that poverty is a moral failure rather than a result of unexpected circumstances. And so when I realized that, I really just ruminated on that and thought, okay, I think that this is the book I want to write, is addressing this from a faith perspective and trying to kind of turn the tide a little bit on that. And it was around that time I really was thinking about this idea of home and how home shows up in Scripture and shows up in worship songs and hymns. And I was thinking about the song Amazing Grace, where I think the second or third verse says, "'Tis grace that brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home." And that line just really stood out to me, and that was kind of an aha, light bulb moment, that it really is this idea of grace that goes against this idea of that certain people deserve poverty. Because if we believe in grace and we believe that God gives salvation, God gives good gifts, God gives love and acceptance to us, not because we deserve it, but because of who God is, then the entire idea of certain people deserving a more miserable life than others just goes out the window. So for me, that helps me understand the larger question and the larger thesis of the book, and then the rest just kind of fell in from there.
Very cool. Good for you. So who would you say the book is most intended for?
Yeah, and it's interesting because I have a variety of different types of readers who, some are, on the more conservative end of the Christian spectrum, and some of my early readers are actually formerly Christian. They've left behind the faith entirely. And I'm getting good responses from both. I would say that who I intended the book to be for was to be for anyone who understands themselves as a person of faith, or at least is familiar and motivated and inspired by the person of Jesus, and who also sees homelessness with an eye of compassion. And I think that that's a lot of people. I try to not paint anyone in the book as not caring, right, about the plight of homelessness. But really my goal with the book is to provide folks who already have some level of compassion with the resources and the knowledge to transform that compassion into something more.
So there have been a lot of books written about homelessness. How would you say that this one is unique?
Hmm. Yeah, there's certainly a lot of books about poverty, and there are some books about homelessness. I will say when I was thinking about writing this book, I wanted to know what else was out there, and I didn't find a whole lot. There have been a couple really good ones that came out since, but largely, especially from a Christian or faith perspective, there haven't been a lot talking about this issue. And the ones that were really more memoir, or were really kind of limited in scope, in the sense that they were reflecting on one person's experience or wisdom that they got from, a particular site where they were, you know, ministering. And I really wanted to zoom out. I tell stories. Talk a lot about my experience working at a particular place. But I wanted to write it about kind of these broader concepts that within the realm of homelessness, that, you know, kind of uh, the inside baseball talk among, like, if you go to conferences on homelessness, the things that we're talking about, like housing first, like trauma-informed care, harm reduction, are not necessarily concepts that are known within the church, but they're really widely recognized. And I wanted to bring those into conversation with faith, with theology, and sort of provide a synthesis. And I talk in the introduction about sort of having my feet, one foot in the church and one foot in the homeless services, and wanting to just turn my head back and forth and talk and sort of translate in between these two groups.
Hmm.
And that's a book that I didn't see.
Hmm. So I want to ask you a question about something you touched on earlier, and I was going to ask you about this anyway. A blurb for the book says that a recent poll found that Christians are more than twice as likely as the general population to associate poverty with lack of effort as opposed to difficult circumstances. Why do you suppose that's the case?
Yeah. So I will say that I do want to provide a correction to that blurb, that it's actually twice as likely as non-Christians. So
Okay.
just to clarify that, and that was from an earlier version, that when we went through the fact-checking process, we realized, oh, that's an important distinction. But
still, it's a big difference.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It's a big difference, and I really think that the ways in which, Christianity in America and the West more broadly have really been associated with capitalism and with Protestant work ethic, really has this ramification. I think something I talk about a lot is the idea of the inverted prosperity gospel, right? And we know that the prosperity gospel is very popular in America, that says if you're a Christian and you follow Jesus, then you'll be blessed with earthly prosperity and wealth and success. The thing that doesn't get said as explicitly, but is implied within that, is that if you don't, then you will have the opposite. You will experience poverty, a lack of success. And the implication there is that if you see someone who is poor, who is living on the streets, that you immediately have all of these assumptions about them, morally, spiritually. And that leads to this idea that in a way that they deserve what they get, or that the path out of that is a spiritual or moral one, right? That if, that a person experiencing homelessness, they could get out of that, and they are choosing to be stubborn, or they refuse to work, or they, that there's some sort of personal thing on their individual end that they need to address in order to participate the rest of us, rather than this more collective communal idea that we have an obligation to provide enough housing, enough resources so that everyone can sleep indoors, so that everyone can have access to, enough money to live on, right? Um, so I think it's an intersection of a lot of different things, and that's why, in many ways, it had to be a book too, because homelessness is not just the intersection of a couple things. It's also, I think, it represents the sort of a collection bin of a lot of the broken systems that we have in this country, whether it's mental health, whether it's substance use, whether it's the housing crisis. All of these things intersect to create trouble for a lot of people, and when all of those things intersect in a particular way, people end up without, a place to call home.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So we've all heard the term Skid Row, but you actually work there. So could you tell viewers what it really is?
Yeah, and I should say I spent a lot of time on Skid Row. The place I worked was technically located in Hollywood, which is a little bit uh, northwest of Skid Row, but I'm not unfamiliar. Skid Row is it's a neighborhood in Los Angeles that historically has been a place of refuge for people who are lower income and experiencing a transitory style of living. And I say it that generally because when it first started as a neighborhood, it wasn't for people who were homeless. It was for temporary workers who were coming from other parts of the country. It was near the train station, and they would come for seasonal working opportunities that were available in Southern California, and there were places to live temporarily where you could pay by the night. And it was a neighborhood specifically designed to house these, transitional workers. And because of that sort of reputation, over time, the neighborhood kind of remained this place for temporary living, right? And unfortunately, at a particular time in Los Angeles history around in the 1980s, a lot of that housing was wiped out. And it's at that point that it really became the place where people experiencing homelessness were. And again, because of that reputation, that's where the gospel rescue missions popped up around the middle of the 20th century, because that's where the need was, if not for people experiencing homelessness necessarily, certainly poverty. And then for a long time, the sort of unwritten policy in Los Angeles was that if someone was experiencing homelessness anywhere in the large county of LA, they would get picked up by a police officer and dropped off in Skid Row and said, "This is where you can be." And unfortunately, you can only do that for so long, and it can only expand so far. That around 2008, we have the crisis, the financial crisis that caused a lot of new homelessness, and then around that same time, downtown was being revitalized, and so all of a sudden there were new boundaries to Skid Row that basically said, well, you can't really go past 4th Street because this is now what we call the Arts District, and the same thing happened on every side. So Skid Row was contained, but there were too many people for it to be contained. So homelessness really exploded all across Los Angeles.
Wow. I had no idea about any of that history.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. So in the book, you say that you've witnessed hell on earth, and you give several examples of that. But you've also had some glimpses of heaven. So would you like to share a little bit of both?
Sure. Yeah, I think I And that's something that was really important as I wrote the book, was uh, to not do what I talk about in the book, especially in the 8th chapter, is what is kind of crudely known as poverty porn, right? That a lot of the stereotypical version of this is the commercial that comes on at midnight where they show you know, starving children or starving pets and play really sad music to get you to feel bad and donate money, right?
Mm-hmm.
The the problem with doing that is it really minimizes the humanity of the individuals you're essentially exploiting to raise money for your organization, right? Even if you are using some of that money toward positive ends, I think it's important to recognize both the direness of the situation that people are in, and also to celebrate the humanity, the resiliency, and even some of the things that I think unhoused people, because of the situation that they're in, are in touch with that some of the rest of us aren't, because we're shielded by privilege, and in many ways are not in touch with some spiritual and interpersonal things that I think we need as humans. And so, yeah, in the conclusion of the book, I kind of personify some of these as understandings of heaven and hell. That hell is that people experiencing homelessness have a 30-year lower life expectancy than people who are in housing. That the combination of substance use that is left untreated because treatment isn't accessible, and mental illness that is untreated with life on the streets makes for some of the most horrifying things I've ever witnessed. I've seen decomposing legs with maggots crawling in them because of a combination of lack of access to good health care and also mental illness that allows somebody to let that continue without seeking emergency services. And again, at the same time, I've seen community formed. I've seen relationships build. I've seen people taking care of each other. And I don't just mean people like me who it's my job, but people who are both experiencing homelessness, forming community and relationships, and a sense of neighborliness that I think a lot of us who are in housing miss out on and misunderstand, because we haven't been put in a situation where we truly depend on one another to survive, right? And so that's something was really careful in my book to make sure that I bore witness to all of that.
It's hard to imagine, for those of us that have not spent a considerable amount of time embedded, in that kind of a situation. It's hard to me at least to imagine what it's like.
Yeah.
So I realize you wrote a whole book about this, but if you were to summarize your recommendations about what we should do about, what seems to be an intractable situation that's multifaceted and complex, what would you say?
Yeah. Well, the amazing thing about talking about homelessness, I do talk about how it's an intersection of all of these issues, and that makes it feel like, well, can we truly solve homelessness without solving every single problem that leads to homelessness? But the answer is actually, yeah, we can, because when you think about homelessness, really the one thing that everyone who experiences homelessness has in common is that they don't have access to housing. And we can solve homelessness with housing. That doesn't mean that we should stop there, right? That therefore, if we end homelessness, that these other issues go away, right? But homelessness sort of represents the worst case scenario, or the very bottom of our safety net that I think we can raise by providing housing. if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at a state like Mississippi, right? Mississippi has the lowest cost of living in the entire country. They also have the least amount of homelessness. And anyone who knows Mississippi doesn't look at Mississippi and say, oh, they don't have poverty. They don't have mental illness. They don't have, you know, they don't have the best access in the world to healthcare, right? Those are still issues that Mississippi needs to address with the people who live there. But what they don't have, because they have affordable housing, they don't have a lot of homelessness. So I think we can use that as an example to say we do still need to reform our mental health system. We need to change the way that we as a country deal with drug use. We need better access to healthcare. We need all of these things. And at the same time, we don't have to just let people languish on the streets until we fix those systems. So I advocate for a very tried and true solution called Housing First for people experiencing homelessness, which is simply that you provide housing to people first, and then you come alongside with all the other services that people need to put their lives back together, providing that housing as a sort of baseline foundation that allows people the opportunity to work on everything else. And it's truly, it's amazing, but also seems so obvious once you really think about it, that once you do have a stable place to sleep and you have the safety and security of a locked door and a bed, that if you do struggle with your mental health, that gets a lot easier to manage. If you do use drugs to cope with chronic pain or trauma, you all of a sudden have less of a need or a desire to cope when you have that safety, that place to call home, right? And again, it's not a magic cure that solves all those problems, but it makes everything so much more manageable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So what would you say your hopes are for this book?
Yeah, I just hope that this book helps people who were already wanting to understand homelessness better, especially people of faith, right, who see homelessness and say, this isn't right. I worship a God who looks upon people with compassion. I worship a Savior who had no place to lay his head, but I don't know what to do. I hope that those people walk away with a better understanding of what the root causes are, and how to address them, not just on a systemic level, because that is important, but also how to have different and better interactions with people that they walk past on the street. And especially folks who are part of communities, church communities, that they have a renewed sense of calling toward the unhoused in their parish, in the neighborhood that they call home, that they would see the encampment down the street or maybe even in their parking lot as part of their neighborhood rather than some mission field or a or worse, like an invasion, an outside force coming in. Yeah, I think that's more than one, but
Yeah, no, it's good.
yeah,
It's good.
that's what I had in mind.
So I realized that you just introduced a new book and you just moved and you just started a new job. But I have to ask you anyway, I mean, if there's anything in the future in terms of either books or projects or what have you that you can talk about.
Yeah. I don't have anything solidified. Yeah, like you said, I've got a lot of newness that I'm settling into, and I'm looking forward to seeing this book come out and have so much hope and excitement for it. And really, I'm just going to let it do its thing. And if it, I hope that I get opportunities to speak. I don't have any sort of official book tour planned, but I do hope to drop by some cities and talk in churches when folks will let me. And I definitely want to write another book, but I don't have a book proposal or a thesis or a title or anything like that. But I've got a lot of different ideas and so many aspects of the book that I wrote could be expanded on and fleshed out even more. So there's no shortage of possibilities, but none of them have really solidified as my next thing yet.
Well, you've got plenty of time. You're young, and
Yes,
as I said, you're busy. So let's bring this book to fruition, and like you said, see what happens.
absolutely. That's the idea.
So don't forget, the name of the book is Grace Can Lead Us Home, A Christian Call to End Homelessness. And you can learn more about it at kevinmnye.com. So Kevin, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks so much for this incredible piece of work. I think it's really going to be helpful for this cause and for helping us all see insights into that we haven't before.
Yeah. Thanks so much for giving me an opportunity to share more about it.
My pleasure. Thank you.